My name is Ginger Bricky. I am a senior clerk here in the genealogy department at Jefferson County Library, Northwest Branch in High Ridge, Missouri. And I'm going to walk you through today on a few tips and tricks on locating your elusive ancestor burial places. There we go. Before you begin your search, gather in any information that you happen to have, the name of the person that you're looking for. Be sure to note any spelling variations and maiden name if applicable. Also, if they happen to use a nickname or a different first name than what they were given at birth, if they have any suffixes or prefixes that could change or could alter your ability to locate their burial place, and any abbreviations that they would have used. The dates of birth and death come as close as you are able to find in your research. Even if you just have a year of birth and a year of death, that will get you somewhere with locating their burial place. Their place of residence. So did they live in a big city, or did they live in a very small community? This is going to make a big difference in pinpointing which cemetery that they could be buried at, or where their grave could be located. How long did they live there? Do they have roots in the area? Are they several generations settled in that area, or did they migrate in from somewhere else? Had they only been there temporarily, and maybe their body would have been sent back to wherever they did have roots, wherever they did have their own ancestors buried. So that could change, if they were established in the community, or if they were pretty new to the area. Family members, living and dead. So do they have deceased parents, grandparents, spouse, children? And if they do, where are they buried? Like I said, with place of residence, if they have roots in some other location, it's possible that their remains would be shipped or taken to that area to be buried with their spouse or their parents or their grandparents. But if they have been in an area for several generations, then it's possible that they would be buried with their family somewhere. So if you can locate, if you can locate the parents or grandparents or a spouse or children, then that'll give you a pretty good idea of where they could be buried. So if you have that information handy, that's good to note. Where could they be? So there are numerous types of cemeteries that you're going to be looking at. The first I have listed is church or denominational cemeteries. These are going to be what's known as a churchyard or located nearby. There are church-connected cemeteries that are no longer close to a church. Either they needed to purchase additional land for more burials, and wherever that cemetery is located is the closest they could find, or the church no longer exists, and so only the cemetery remains. What?
Someone's trying to join the class and they can't get
in. Hold on just a moment. I changed the settings. No, there's nobody in the waiting room. I changed the settings for the waiting room. There shouldn't be a waiting room now.
Well, I'll go back and just tell them to try again.
Who, do you have a name? Because I can.
That one.
Yeah, I'm not even seeing anyone in the waiting. There's not a waiting room anymore because I can't see the sidebar when I have my screen up. So there isn't anyone, there's no one in the waiting room. There isn't a waiting room, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Yeah, yeah, it must be something technical on her end because I've got people that are coming in fine. Thank you. Okay. Let me get back to my share screen here. Sorry about that. Fun technical difficulties. Okay. So the church cemeteries are going to be affiliated with a church. Most of the big ones that you'll see are connected to the Catholic Church, and then of course other denominations have their own burial grounds as well. These are generally reserved for members of the church and their families, but there are a lot of church cemeteries that will accept anyone. Private ownership, this is going to be non-sectarian, so they're not affiliated with a church or denomination. They are a for-profit business. So these are going to be owned by funeral homes, fraternal orders like the Odd Fellows Lodge, individual or family-owned businesses. Sometimes these are passed through generationally. So some individual that owns a cemetery generally will own a funeral home, and they have inherited this business from family. So these are for-profit businesses, and they will sometimes have their own monument company and funeral home. National, state, or city-owned or public cemeteries. These are going to be, you know, the town square type cemeteries. Some city-owned cemeteries were once private or church-owned. So there are examples of what was once the church cemetery. So specifically, one that I was researching just recently for a patron is Gatewood Gardens. So Gatewood Gardens is located along Gravois Road, just before the River des Peres in St. Louis City. And Gatewood Gardens was once known as Pickers Cemetery. And there's new Pickers, old Pickers, and then the old Pickers. So Gatewood Gardens was once owned by a church, and then the church is defunct, and now it was purchased by someone else, and then that was, I think he was behind on taxes, possibly on the property. One way or another, the city of St. Louis did acquire the cemetery, and the name was changed to Gatewood Gardens. And so you would contact the city of St. Louis for any information in regards to finding an ancestor buried at Pickers Cemetery. So the next one listed here is family cemeteries. These are going to be your most elusive of burial grounds to locate, because they are going to be, you know, what I call out on the back 40. They're going to be, you know, grandma and grandpa were buried on the farm because they had children they buried on the farm. Some of these family burial grounds were also community burial grounds. So the family that owned the property may be buried there, but then also their neighbors buried with them. So it became kind of a community cemetery, what once would start as a family cemetery. There we go. Okay, show me the records. So once you have your initial information, the name, the dates, where they resided, all your basic information to start your search, you want to go to the internet and start there. The first website I have listed here is Ancestry.com. You can access this database for free at the library using your library card. And they have a wide variety of death records, cemetery records, funeral home records, obits, the Social Security Death Index. So this is just a small example of what they have in their catalog that you can search through. Of course, I have some Missouri specific, but they have record collections that cover, you know, the United States and on a global scale as well. FamilySearch.org, of course, is the site that I use the most. This is a free access website that you can use at home. But we do offer special access here at the library. We are a designated history, family history library. So there are records collections that you can access in their catalog from the library that you cannot access at home. Either way, the database access is free. You can use it from anywhere, just signing up for free for an account and looking through their catalog. This is just a small listing again of what they have available on their website. Obituaries and death notices. The newspaper index database, the NIDB, which you can find on jeffcolib.org. If you go to the genealogy and local history page, you're going to see an index of Jefferson County newspapers that was created here in our genealogy department with our newspaper microfilm. So now, of course, since the beginning of the year, there are a lot of the Jefferson County newspapers that have been digitized and they have been made searchable on newspapers.com. Before that, a database was created in-house to index any births, deaths, marriages, divorces, interesting tidbits about the locals in our newspaper microfilm collection. These newspapers go back to 1866. And so you can search our newspaper index for names of your ancestors to see what we've indexed about them, to find death notices, obituaries. You may even find if they were sick leading up to their passing. You may find mention of them being in ill health. Now that we have local digitized papers on newspapers.com, I really like using the newspaper index database in conjunction with the newspapers.com because the index is going to give me the specific location of what I'm looking for. So if I'm looking for someone's death and we've indexed it in the database, it's going to tell me what newspaper, what page and what column I will find that death notice in. So newspapers.com is free to access from anywhere with your library card. You can also visit the Library of Congress website, Chronicling America. They've got a very large database of digitized newspapers from all over the world. Cindy's List, which I recommend for any type of research you're doing. I have specifically included her page for newspapers, where to find newspapers for anywhere online. Obit City is a great collection of obituaries, even currently. Legacy.com is also an incredible resource for archived obituaries. This is going to be more recent. If you're going, I would say their oldest is probably in the 2000s. So if you're anywhere before that, then you'll want to check a newspaper database. Grave locator websites. Find a Grave is probably the most popular. It's a very large volunteer created, I would say volunteer curated website where the deceased has a memorial created for them, and you can add photos of the headstone, you can add photos of the deceased, you can add an obituary or biography information. You can link family members who are deceased to the memorial. These memorials can give you a birth and death date. They can give you a cemetery location. They can give you a plot number sometimes. It all just depends on what information the volunteer has added to the memorial. So Find a Grave is a free database to access from anywhere, and is searchable, and is currently owned by Ancestry.com, and it's an incredible resource. Billion Graves is very similar. It's also volunteer driven, and so people upload death information and headstone photos to that website as well. There are also cemetery websites that have searchable databases for church or privately owned generally. I know the Archdiocese does have a searchable database for all of their Catholic cemeteries. And then larger cemeteries like Bellefontaine and St. Louis, they have an incredible search feature on their website. And more cemeteries are starting to digitize their records and make them searchable online. And so depending on the type of cemetery or where it's located, you may be able to find a searchable database connected to that cemetery online. Missouri Gravestones Photo Project, MissouriGravestones.org. This is another great volunteer project. And of course, they do have other states available. I've pinpointed Missouri. And this is a database of headstones from all over the state. And it just depends on what people have uploaded onto the website, whether you will find your ancestor on there or not. And the US GenWeb Tombstone Transcription Project, this is actually one of my little volunteer projects. I'm the manager for the Missouri page on the US GenWeb site. And so I receive cemetery transcription lists that I upload onto that database. And so it's searchable. And there's also a companion photo project that you can visit. Funeral homes and churches. Create a list of funeral and burial service providers in the area where you're searching, and be sure to note contact information. So if you know the town where your ancestor lived or where they died, and depending on the time frame, what was available, what was in business, who had a funeral service or burial service in that area in the time frame that you're looking at. And you may have to dig into archives to get that information, but if it's more recent, then you should be able to check in like online phone books, white pages, that sort of thing online to get a list of funeral homes and burial service providers like churches and monument companies, and collect their contact information. Cemetery GPS locations. So like on Find a Grave, they do sometimes have a feature where if you're at the grave site, you can pinpoint the GPS location of that grave. And not everyone uses that feature, but it is an option. You can also visit the cemetery link on Find a Grave, and it will sometimes pull up a digital image or like a Google map of the cemetery's location. So that can be helpful too, to pinpoint where it's located. GIS maps, these are the, you can find these generally on assessors' websites. So like your county government, if you go on there and look for property ownership information or the assessor's link, you can usually find a GIS map link. And this is going to give you kind of a Google Earth view of the county you are looking in, and the property lines, the current property lines, and it will give you information on who the taxpayer is on that property or who holds ownership. And so you can, it will have cemeteries on the map labeled as a cemetery in most cases, and especially if they are exempted on anyone's land deeds. Google Earth is also a great way to pinpoint cemetery locations. You can really get interactive with it and save your maps and drop pins on areas you're looking in. Missouri death records. I say it every time I talk about this, that we are so fortunate here in Missouri that we have Missouri Digital Heritage. And this is through the Secretary of State office in Jefferson City, that every year they have volunteers who index and transcribe death certificates and create PDF images of those certificates and put them into a searchable database. Currently, the database is from 1910 to 1970. And then if you're looking at anything pre-1910, death certificates were not required then, but there are transcriptions from death ledgers for certain areas. So you can check that website to see if the area you're searching is available there. Visiting archives. And you know what, I'm gonna go back just a moment. I want to mention that some cemetery locations that you find on these death records, they're not always accurate. And if you've done research for any amount of time, you've probably come across that sometimes records contradict themselves. And so such is the case sometimes with death certificates, that it may say that your ancestor was buried or picked up from a certain cemetery, but that they ended up being brought somewhere else. So the information that went on the death certificate isn't always accurate to what happened. Also, there may be spelling errors that could complicate things or make it difficult for you to find a death record for your ancestor. Visiting archives and records depositories. Libraries, of course. We really do have an incredible genealogy and local history department here. And I'm not just saying that because they pay me, but also this was my library before I became an employee. And when I first moved to this county, one of the first places that I visited was the genealogy department here, and started learning about the history of the county. And it's not only just local history that our collection includes. We have collections covering all of the counties in Missouri, and we have a family histories collection. We have collections for other states and military and Canada and Native American. So it covers a lot of bases. And so regardless of where you're looking, it does not have to be Jefferson County related. We welcome researchers from everywhere. doesn't have to be county focused. We will still assist you with your search, and we have resources that will assist you with your search. Historical societies and genealogical societies. We do have an in-house genealogical society, Jefferson County Genealogical Society. They have helped us build our collection. And so we interact with a lot of the people who contact them for research assistance. We do have other historical societies in this county, and most counties have at least one that you can reach out to for information. Some have a physical location, some do not. So that's something you'll want to check before you go out into the field. Missouri State Archives, located in Jefferson City. They have an insanely extensive collection, such an amazing place. I don't know that they are offering tours again. I think they're doing appointments for research maybe right now. I'm not sure. You'll have to check their website to determine where they're at with their restrictions. But hopefully once everything is lifted and they are offering tours again, take advantage of that. It is an incredible location, beautiful building, and they are so knowledgeable on state history. This is a great place to look for information. Funeral homes and cemetery offices. Of course, funeral homes are going to be the ones doing the service before your ancestor was buried. And the cemetery offices are going to have record of that burial in many cases. So these are two great locations to look for information. Of course, depending on the time frame, the funeral home may no longer be in business. There may not be a cemetery office where you're going. So that can complicate things, but going back to the beginning of the list with libraries and historical societies and genealogical societies, these are the people who know about the history of the location. And so if you're looking for a funeral home or a cemetery office that no longer exists, these are the people to talk to on where you can find those records, if anything was ever archived from those places, what still exists that you can search through to find your ancestors' burial. Churches are a great place to look. Generally, if your ancestor was a member of a church in the community, then the church would have record of if they were buried in the churchyard or where they were buried, or at least when they died. So churches, if your family belonged to a community church, that can be a good place to look for information. Courthouses are also very helpful when you're trying to locate a cemetery location. They're not going to be so much helpful on pinpointing a burial, but finding a cemetery, especially in the case of like a family cemetery, courthouses are going to be one of your best friends during that search. They're going to have land deed records, property information, who holds deeds currently, who held property deeds in the past. And of course, here at Jefferson County Library, Northwest Branch, we have the Dave Halliman Cemetery Collection. And this contains 20 plus binders full of cemetery locations, transcriptions, and history of land for every township in Jefferson County. Dave Halliman was very passionate about recording burials around our county, and he donated this information to our collection, and now it is in its own area. It's easy to locate and search through. The obituary collection that we have in our cemetery collection contains obits and funeral notices from late 1800s to 2000s. We also have newspaper databases online through our website that you can access to find more current obits through the St. Louis Post-Dispatch or other newspaper resources. Newspapers on microfilm. These are the Jefferson County newspapers that we indexed on the newspaper index database. We also have St. Louis papers on microfilm. There are newspapers in Jefferson County that did not get digitized, and so we have those available. The Jefferson County Record, I believe, is one of them. Local church records, we have several varieties of church records. We have them in book form. We have microfilm church records you can search through. We have books from the churches themselves, and then we have records collections that have been transcribed and bound. Wills and probate records. We have those on microfilm with a searchable index. Plat maps. We have the 1876 and 1898 plat maps for Jefferson County. And these are, which page am I on here? These are going to show you also the family maps, the original land deed holders for Jefferson County and other counties in Missouri and in other states. But the plat maps that we have are going to show you who was owning what land and when. And there are indications on these maps of orchards and structures, churches, homes, and cemeteries. So you can pinpoint where the cemeteries are located and whose property it would have been on at different times through history. We also have land records. So you can look up tax records, deeds we have on microfilm. And all are welcome to use our resources. You do not need to be a county resident to come here and do research, or send us an email, or pick up the phone and give us a call if you have questions about your research. We are happy to help you, even if you're not a county resident. Some tips for finding those elusive family burial grounds. These really are the trickiest graves to locate because they can be anywhere. A lot of family cemeteries have been plowed over. Headstones have been relocated. They are just lost to time. You would never know that there was a cemetery on that property at any time. They vanish, they disappear. Which is unfortunate, especially if your ancestors are buried at one of these family cemeteries. So some of the tricks that I have found or tips for locating these elusive family burials is to check land deeds for any property that is accepted. Typically, this would be from 1/4 to 1 acre of property. In the land deed, it will give the legal description of the property that is being exchanged, except for this little section here where there's a family cemetery. Generally, the family cemeteries did not, ownership did not transfer at time of sale. So the original family would still hold ownership over that burial ground. So if you see that word accepted or accepting written in a land deed legal description, then you know that there is a cemetery on that property. Also look for the little cross symbol on plat maps. This is going to, like I said before, this is going to indicate burial locations. So some plat maps will have them, and then the next year it comes out, it won't have it. So depending on who knows about what cemetery at the time that plat map is being designed, you may find a symbol like that on the property and you may not. So it's always good to check multiple years of plat maps. Locate burials of any relatives of the deceased. Where are they? Where are their parents buried? Do they have a spouse who died? Where are they? Do they have grandparents who are buried nearby? See if you can locate anyone in the family. Sometimes it's just aunts and uncles and cousins that they happen to be resting nearby. Anyone in the family, where are they buried? Make a list of all of these burials and check them. Ask local funeral homes and monument companies about family burial grounds. I have seen these family cemeteries with graves going back to the mid 1800s, and then all of a sudden there will be a burial in like the 1950s because that person, probably a genealogist, who knew that she had ancestors buried in that cemetery and she knew that she had a right to be buried there. And so there you go, there's this new grave suddenly appearing. So talk to the local funeral homes and monument companies about any burials in kind of out of the way family cemeteries. Research state cemetery laws before you go. Another thing that's great about Missouri is their cemetery laws. They are very visitor friendly. So in Missouri, and I like to keep a copy of the cemetery law in my vehicle if I'm out searching for these hard to find or what's considered private property cemeteries. So Missouri cemetery law states that any well-meaning visitor to a cemetery located on private property cannot be prohibited from visiting that cemetery during a reasonable hour. So if there is a family cemetery located in the middle of someone's farmland, it's courtesy to ask permission. But if they deny you access to the cemetery, you have a legal standing to be able to access the burials. So do some homework and research on state cemetery laws before you go out in the field. Missing. So, okay, let's say you have located your ancestors' burial place, but you get there and you can't find anything. There's nothing there. So now what do you do? Well, you can check wills and probate for a request or a receipt of monument purchase. One of the tiny family cemeteries just down the road here that is located in the middle of a subdivision now. In the probate file, there is record of the widow requesting money from the estate to put up a proper monument for her husband and to enclose the place of burial. So she enclosed it with a wall and she put up a monument for him. And then she also put up a big stone kind of a pedestal where she had placed a photo of him. And so she had requested this money from the estate, and there is proof of that in the probate file. So that could be a big help if you're not sure where the unmarked grave could be or where, if where the unmarked grave could be if the monument is missing now, sorry. Look around the area for a family lot. So if you're looking for parents, grandparents, anyone else in the family, relatives of any sort who are buried nearby, does it seem like they're clustered together? Could they be in a family lot? Does it seem like there are empty spaces in the family lot? This is something that you can compare with cemetery records. If the cemetery has lot cards that you can access, the lot cards or the burial, the plot cards can give you an idea of who's buried there. And then if they have a family lot, excuse me, if they have a family lot, then you can compare who's buried there that you can visibly tell and what the any empty spaces belong to. Do you notice any bare spots or dead grass where the stone should be or near where the stone should be? Is there a base but no marker? This can indicate a fallen stone, especially with like the tablet style stones. These tend to get weak in the base, or they can be knocked over in some other way. And when they fall down, it over time, the grass and the earth just tends to kind of swallow it up. And so if they still remain fairly shallow on the surface of the ground, grass is not going to grow very well over that stone. So if you notice any bare spots, it could be that the stone has fallen over and the grass has tried to grow over it. Also check for any dips in the ground. If we are talking burial pre-vault usage or wooden coffin usage, in these times, there would have been a lot of settling over time that would cause dips in the ground where these burials are located. So if you can kind of stand back and see any dips in the ground where you think your ancestor is buried, that would be a good indication that there's a grave there. The cemetery lot records may have information on whether a monument was installed on the grave or on the lot. Has the cemetery relocated or removed any stones? This seems shocking to some people, but there are a lot of cases of cemeteries relocating or removing stones, especially if they're having trouble with maintenance. At one time, there were footstones that were used on graves. And so your ancestor would have a headstone, and then they would have a much smaller footstone. And the footstone generally would have the initials of the deceased on it. And most cemeteries have pulled these up over time because it makes it easier to mow the cemetery. And since they already have a headstone, the footstone isn't really necessary. And so they will remove these stones. And so the same can be said for headstones as well. There are several cemeteries that come to mind right now that have relocated stones to repurpose the ground where the graves are located. They sometimes move the graves and sometimes not, but the stones are relocated or removed. So it's important to check with the history of the cemetery if anything like this has happened in their past. If you suspect that a fallen stone is present underground, ask permission, if available, to probe or metal detect the area. Probing is done with a metal rod that is used to penetrate the ground in search of buried headstones. You generally don't have to go too far into the ground, but it is easier and much more productive to use when the ground is soft. So a day or two after a good hard rain is a good time to do that. Metal detecting, of course, locating metal from a casket. Metal from a casket would set off your metal detector. If you find a buried marker, consult an experienced cemetery preservationist or a monument company to assist with resetting, depending on the type of stone it is and how long it's been in the ground. They can be very fragile and very heavy. They are much heavier than they look. So it's always important to be safe and careful of not injuring yourself and not causing any damage to the stone. You can also try grave dowsing, and this is done with handheld metal rods that cross over each other when they are moved over a grave location or any type of disturbed ground. The state of Missouri does employ dowsers to locate underground water sources and buried utilities. And so any place that the ground has been disturbed at some point, generally these dowsing rods will work to pinpoint where that's at. If you have access to ground penetrating radar, that is also a really great option, but not many people have access to that. A few more points I wanted to share. Document every checked resource and make note of any leads discovered. If you're calling funeral homes, you're calling cemetery offices, make a note of who you're talking to, any information they were able to provide, online resources. There are some really great free blank forms online that you can use to log your research. And so you can make a notation every time you try to find something online or talk to someone in person or over the phone. And talk to the locals. Get out into the community where your ancestors were living and meet people. See who knows what. You'd be surprised, some of the people in the community that have been established here for a long time, they tend to know a few things about where people are buried. And so it's a good idea to just get out and meet people and ask questions. Check the archives for defunct funeral and cemetery service providers. What time period did they serve? There are undertakers who were also furniture makers. And so you're going to find a furniture store and an undertaking establishment. And these are the people who buried the dead or provided caskets or provided transportation to and from the cemetery. So it's good to check old newspaper advertisements and stories, any kind of history of the area for any funeral or cemetery service that would have been available at the time of your ancestor's death. Did your ancestor have immediate family to care for their remains after death? Did they have someone to provide a grave and a headstone for them? Generally, if there wasn't someone to purchase a headstone for them, then they would be in an unmarked grave. And of course, headstones were not cheap. Even today, you can either afford a headstone or you can't. And so there are a lot of cases where your family or your ancestors' family or a family friend, whoever was providing for the deceased, maybe they couldn't financially get a headstone in that moment, or maybe they used one that deteriorated over time, like a wooden cross or some kind of statuary. Were they involved in any military conflicts? Were they in the Civil War? Were they in a war that would have been outside of the country? Were they killed in battle? Did they stay in an area after the war was over? See their timeline of where they were moving around compared to when they died. And that can give you a clue of where they're buried. I have a third great grandfather buried in Tennessee because that's where he was during the Civil War, and he got sick during battle and was hospitalized and died in a military hospital in Tennessee, and his family could not afford to bring him back to Missouri, and so he's buried in the National Cemetery there. So no one else down there that I'm related to except for him. And so he's down there alone. And that threw me off for a little bit until I traced his Civil War records to figure out where he was at the time of his death. Were your ancestors destitute or institutionalized? This is a very tricky situation when you're dealing with poor farms, asylums, sanitariums. The cemetery records are nearly non-existent. Most counties had a poor farm or a pest house at some time in their history, and there would have been a cemetery connected with these places. Of course, many of these places have kind of been lost to time, and the cemeteries have been forgotten. These graves typically would not have been marked in any way, and so you wouldn't know looking that that there's anyone buried there. Asylum and sanitarium, any kind of institution, cemetery would be very similar. The Fulton Insane Asylum Cemetery, I would say 98% of the graves in that cemetery are just marked with a concrete block that has a 3-digit number on it. So there would be quite a few steps involved with trying to identify where your ancestor would be buried in a place like that. So it gets trickier when you're dealing with places that are of a medical or personal care type facility where they would have died. Maybe your ancestor traveled to a different climate when they became ill. A lot of tuberculosis and cholera sufferers would have gone west to find a better climate, and in many cases, I'm sure, would die in that location. I want to thank you all for joining me today. I hope that you were able to take something away from this that will help you in your research. And if there's anything further that I can help you with,